The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a constant whispering percussion against the cedar shingles of my father's house. Here, nestled among the towering Douglas firs and misty hills outside Seattle, the silence inside was a living thing, a profound emptiness where his booming voice and solid presence used to be. The house itself, a masterpiece of Pacific Northwest modernism, with its vast windows, warm timber, and stone fireplaces, had always felt like his fortress. Now, it felt like his mausoleum. I stood in the great room, the cool, damp air carrying the faint, beloved scent of his life, pipe tobacco, rain-soaked earth from his hiking boots, and the crisp smell of old paper from his library. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the intricate grain of a hand-carved totem pole that stood sentinel by the hearth. He had commissioned it from a local Lummi artist decades ago. Like my father, Elias Moreau, it was solid, unyielding, and deeply rooted in this land. He was a titan of Northwest industry, the founder of Moreau Enterprises. But to me, he was the man who taught me to navigate by the stars, and who held a quiet, unshakable belief that a person's character was their only true north. A belief that, from the moment I introduced them, he never felt my husband, Damien, possessed. "He's too smooth, Juliet," my father had said once, his gaze fixed on the turbulent waters of the Puget Sound from this very window. A river stone is smoothed by the current, but it started out with rough edges. This man, I think he was born smooth. I had defended Damien, of course, attributing my father's skepticism to a generational gap, a natural paternal protectiveness. For 5 years, I had insisted he was wrong, and in the days since my father's passing, Damien had proven me right. He had become my entire world, a bulwark against the tidal wave of grief. He handled every numbing detail, from the funeral arrangements to fielding endless calls, all while holding me close and whispering promises of a future he would build for us, a future that was safe and secure. He entered the room now, his expensive Italian loafers silent on the slate floor. Damien was impossibly handsome, with a charm that seemed to polish every surface it touched. He wrapped his strong arms around me from behind, his chin resting gently on my head as we stared out at the rain-swept landscape. "How are you doing, my love?" he murmured, his voice a low, comforting hum. I leaned back into his solid embrace, a wave of profound gratitude washing over the sharp edges of my sorrow. I would be utterly adrift without him. "I'm surviving," I lied, my voice thick with unshed tears. "This house, it's just so full of him." "I know. That's why we need to look forward," he said, turning me gently to face him. His dark eyes, usually so full of quick intelligence, were now softened with what I saw as deep, unwavering love. "Listen, Juliet, the reading of the will is tomorrow at Griffith & Sons. It's going to be brutal, hearing it all laid out like that. I've been thinking nonstop about how to protect you, how to shelter you from the fallout." He led me to the custom-made sofa, his hand a warm, steady pressure in the small of my back. "Your father didn't just leave behind a portfolio, he left behind an empire. Moreau Enterprises is a complex beast. The board, the investments, the taxes, it's a full-time war, especially for someone who is grieving. I want to take that war on for you." He paused, his expression a perfect portrait of earnest concern. "I had my attorney draft some documents. It's a straightforward asset management agreement. It allows me to consolidate the entire inheritance into a single, protected trust under my primary management. It's for us, darling, for our future. So you can take the time you need to heal, without having to worry about a single stock ticker or legal filing." I looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of the man my father had distrusted. I found none. I saw only my husband, my partner, the man who had held my hand through every trial. My father had been a brilliant man, but about this he had been mistaken. Damien was selfless. He was my rock. "It's the smartest move, Juliet," he said softly, his thumb stroking my cheek. "It's the only way we can begin to build our life together, free from all this complexity." I finally let the tears fall, nodding my head in weary assent. "Okay, Damien," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Whatever you think is best. I trust you." That evening, Damien guided me into my father's study. The room was Elias Moreau's heartwood, paneled in rich, fragrant western red cedar. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, filled not just with business texts, but with worn volumes of poetry, philosophy, and local history. Another wall featured topographical maps of the Cascade Mountain Range, crisscrossed with the faint pencil lines of his planned hikes. It felt profoundly wrong to be here, in this sacred space, to sign documents that would dismantle and repurpose the very legacy he had built within these walls. But Damien's logic was a fortress against which my emotional turmoil had no defense. My mind was a fog. I was a ship without a rudder, and he was offering to be my port. On the massive, clean surface of my father's desk lay a thick stack of professionally bound documents. Next to them, a heavy silver fountain pen sat gleaming under the soft light of a desk lamp. It was one of my father's favorites. The sight of it all, so starkly official, so final, made my stomach coil into a tight, cold knot. My father was gone, and his life's work was now just a pile of paper, a series of clauses and subclauses waiting for my signature. Damien pulled out the heavy leather chair, my father's chair, and gestured for me to sit. Sinking into it, I felt dwarfed by its presence, a child playing at being a grown-up in a world I didn't understand. Damien stood behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. It was meant to be a gesture of support, but tonight it felt like an anchor holding me in place. "It's not as intimidating as it looks, I promise," he said, his voice a soothing melody designed to calm a skittish animal. He leaned over, flipping through the top pages with an easy confidence. His manicured finger traced lines of dense, impenetrable legalese. "This section here establishes the Moreau Family Trust. This one gives me authority as the primary irrevocable trustee. All very standard for high net worth estate planning. It minimizes our tax exposure and protects the core assets from market fluctuations. The key is consolidation. You won't have to deal with a dozen different accountants, investment bankers, and corporate lawyers. You'll only ever have to deal with me." I stared at the pages, the words swimming before my eyes. Fiduciary duty, irrevocable transfer, unfettered power of attorney, beneficiary designation. A cold tendril of pure dread snaked its way up my spine. A vivid memory surfaced, my father sitting in this very chair, helping me with a college application. He'd slid the financial aid form across the desk and said, his voice firm but kind, "Read every word, Juliet, twice. Never ever sign your name to something you don't understand from top to bottom. A signature is a promise, and a promise is the measure of a person." The echo of his voice was a faint alarm bell, but it was drowned out by the louder, more immediate reality of my overwhelming grief and my husband's reassuring presence. "Damien," I began, my voice wavering as I looked up at him. "It seems so absolute. The word irrevocable." He immediately knelt beside my chair, capturing my hand in both of his. His gaze was magnetic, drawing me in. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his voice dropping to a low, fervent whisper. "I love you, Juliet Moreau. I would rather die than do anything to harm you. This is about protecting us. This is me building a wall around you so you can have the space to heal. Let me carry this for you. Let me be your strength. Please." He picked up the heavy silver pen and placed it gently in my hand, his fingers closing over mine, warm and firm. "Just sign at the bottom of each page," he murmured, his voice a hypnotic rhythm. "Then it's done. We can close this painful chapter and finally start our life, free and clear." I looked from his earnest, devoted face to the stark black ink of the signature line. He was my husband. This was his promise. Swallowing the hard lump of fear in my throat, I pressed the nib to the paper. My hand, guided by his, moved in the familiar loops and swirls of my name. With each signature, I felt not a sense of relief, but a strange hollow echo, as if a great heavy door had just swung shut somewhere deep inside me. The morning of the reading broke gray and solemn, the sky over the sound a seamless, weeping sheet of pewter. A fine mist clung to the evergreen trees, making them look like silent mourning giants. I stood before the antique mirror in my bedroom, my reflection a pale, hollow-eyed stranger in a simple, well-tailored black wool dress. It felt less like clothing and more like a shroud. In the reflection behind me, Damien was fastening the clasp on a ridiculously expensive watch, his movements crisp and efficient. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably cut suit, a shirt so white it was almost blinding, and a somber charcoal tie. Now, as I stepped into the grand entryway of the home that was truly, unassailably mine, the silence greeted me like an old friend. It was no longer the hollow silence of loss, but the clean, expansive silence of liberation and peace. The air, rich with the smell of cedar and the damp earth, no longer felt like a memory of my father, but a continuation of his spirit. It was the smell of sanctuary. Our reflections stood together in the mirror, the broken woman and her handsome, capable protector. But his smile seemed painted on, a gesture that didn't quite connect with the restless, triumphant light I could now see dancing in his eyes. There was a coiled, kinetic energy about him today, a barely suppressed excitement. At breakfast, he'd been talking animatedly about a trip we could take. As soon as this unpleasantness was behind us, I made my way to my father's study, the scene of my greatest folly and ultimately, my redemption. The massive desk, the wall of books, the topographical maps, they no longer seemed intimidating. A complete reset. I'd tried to see it as his clumsy but sweet attempt to give me a light at the end of this dark tunnel. Now, in the oppressive silence of the bedroom, it felt disturbingly like he was planning his victory lap. On the corner of the desk, next to a polished geode from one of his climbs, sat a framed photograph of my father and me on a sailboat, the wind in our hair, the mountains stark and beautiful behind us. We were both laughing. His eyes in the picture were so fiercely proud, so full of life. I picked it up, my thumb tracing the line of his strong jaw. "You knew," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "You knew what he was, and you still trusted me to figure it out for myself. You didn't rescue me. You gave me the tools to rescue myself." The tears that finally came were not of sorrow or betrayal, but of a love so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room, a warm hand on my shoulder. His final, brilliant act was not one of control but of ultimate empowerment. Mr. Griffith had pressed a simple, unmarked envelope into my hand as I left. "Elias left this for you," he'd said, "for when you were ready." I sat down in my father's chair, my chair, and opened it. Inside was not a legal document, but a single sheet of his heavy cream-colored stationery, covered in his familiar, strong handwriting. "My dearest Juliet," it began, "if you are reading this letter, it means you have found the voice I always knew you possessed. I am sorry for the pain you had to walk through to find it, but I am not sorry for my faith in you. Remember that this house, this company, this land, they are not your inheritance. They are merely the tools. Your true inheritance is your mind, your integrity, and the strength of your character. I just wanted it to be over." The setting sun broke through the clouds, casting long, golden shafts of light across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The future, a terrifying, dark chasm just that morning, now stretched before me, a path paved with light. Tomorrow, I would call a meeting with the board of Moreau Enterprises. I would start by learning everything about the environmental foundation he was so passionate about. I would take hiking lessons and climb one of the mountains on his maps. The morning of the reading broke gray and solemn, the sky over the sound a seamless, weeping sheet of pewter. A fine mist clung to the evergreen trees, making them look like silent morning giants. I stood before the antique mirror in my bedroom, my reflection a pale, hollow-eyed stranger in a simple, well-tailored black wool dress. It felt less like clothing and more like a shroud. In the reflection behind me, Damien was fastening the clasp on a ridiculously expensive watch, his movements crisp and efficient. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably cut suit, a shirt so white it was almost blinding, and a somber charcoal tie. He didn't look like a grieving son-in-law. He looked like a predator who had just been handed the keys to the reserve. The thought was so ugly, so disloyal, that I immediately flinched from it, blaming my exhausted, grief-addled mind. "You're the most beautiful woman in the world, even in mourning," he said, his voice smooth as he came to stand behind me. He slid his arms around my waist, pulling me against him. "Griffith," I managed to say, my throat tight. His keen, pale blue eyes, the color of glacial ice, shifted to Damien. His warm expression instantly evaporated, replaced by a veneer of cool, professional civility. There was a coiled, kinetic energy about him today, a barely suppressed excitement. At breakfast, he'd been talking animatedly about a trip we could take, as soon as this unpleasantness was behind us. I was thinking about a charter yacht in the Greek Isles, he'd mused, scrolling through pictures on his phone. We could be gone for a month. You deserve it. A complete reset. I'd tried to see it as his clumsy but sweet attempt to give me a light at the end of this dark tunnel. Now, in the oppressive silence of the bedroom, it felt disturbingly like he was planning his victory lap. I don't know if I can do this, Damien, I confessed, my voice so quiet I could barely hear it myself. The thought of sitting in a sterile boardroom while a stranger dissected my father's soul felt like an unbearable violation. You are the strongest person I know, he said, kissing my temple. His lips were cool against my skin. And you're not alone. I'm right beside you. Remember, all the hard decisions are already made. We took care of the legal maze last night. Today is just a performance, a formality for the family. He squeezed my waist gently. We'll get through the next few hours and then our life begins. Just us. That phrase, just us, had once been my favorite song. My mind began to drift, the complex legal phrases a meaningless drone. I felt Damien's hand find mine under the table, his thumb stroking my knuckles in a gesture of solidarity. I summoned a weak, grateful smile for him. I had to hold on. The drive into downtown Seattle was a blur of gray concrete and weeping skies. Damien drove his sleek German sedan with one hand, the other resting possessively on my thigh. It was a gesture he'd made 1,000 times, one I'd always found comforting. Today it felt like a brand, a mark of ownership. I stared out the window, watching the rain trace frantic, meaningless patterns on the glass. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, unadulterated dread that I couldn't explain away. I kept repeating a mantra in my head. It's just the day. It's just the finality. It will be over soon. But a deeper, colder intuition, a voice that sounded frighteningly like my father's, whispered that it was not an ending, but a beginning of something terrible. I clutched my black leather purse in my lap, my knuckles turning white. I just wanted it to be over. It was in that precise moment of peak vulnerability, as the weight of my father's world threatened to shatter me, that Damien leaned in. He squeezed my hand, a sharp, insistent pressure that felt less like comfort and more like a signal. His lips brushed against the shell of my ear, and he whispered, the words a cold, venomous dart in the warm, stuffy room. Remember what we agreed. For us. And my blood, my heart, my very soul ran cold. It was not a gradual chill, not a creeping sense of unease. It was a plunge into the freezing black waters of the Puget Sound in midwinter. The shock was so absolute it stole the air from my lungs. Damien's whisper, meant as a secret promise between loving partners, echoed in the sudden, silent cavern of my mind with a monstrous new resonance. For us. The words detonated, shattering my reality into a million sharp, glittering pieces of a truth I had spent 5 years refusing to see. My heart, which had been beating a slow, mournful dirge, exploded into a frantic, terrified gallop. The opulent room, the concerned face of my aunt, the steady voice of Mr. Griffith, it all receded, fading into an indistinct, muffled background. The only sound was the roar of blood in my ears, and that whisper, that terrible, triumphant whisper playing on a loop. My mind, which had been a thick fog of grief for days, was now brutally, horrifically clear. A lifetime of my father's wisdom, 1,000 small lessons in observation and character judgment, came rushing back. It was as if a dam had broken. Disconnected memories, small and insignificant at the time, now slammed together, forming a perfect, damning mosaic of Damien's true nature. His over-the-top charm. The way he'd talked about Moreau Enterprises not as a legacy, but as an untapped asset. The subtle, almost imperceptible condescension in his voice when he spoke to my father. The way he'd so expertly and lovingly isolated me, becoming the sole arbiter of my reality in my moment of greatest weakness. I saw him again, kneeling beside me in my father's study, his eyes shining with what I had mistaken for devotion. It was not love. It was the purest, most undiluted avarice I had ever witnessed. It was the gleam in a predator's eye when the trap has finally sprung. The papers. Dear God, the papers. Irrevocable transfer. Unfettered power of attorney. The legal terms I had allowed him to dismiss as boilerplate now screamed at me from the page of my memory. I hadn't signed a partnership agreement. I had signed an instrument of my own destruction. I had willingly, trustingly, handed the man I loved a loaded gun, and he had it pointed directly at my head. My father's warnings, his quiet, persistent disapproval that I had long dismissed as the overprotective grumbling of an old man, now felt like unheard prophecies. He had seen it. From the very beginning, his shrewd, perceptive eyes had pierced Damien's polished veneer and seen the rot underneath. He saw the cold calculation, the boundless ambition, the hollow core where a conscience should have been. I felt a wave of cold sweat prickle my skin. I risked a glance at my husband, the man whose hand was still resting on mine. I really looked at him, past the handsome mask of concern he wore so well. I saw the faint, smug curl at the edge of his lips. I saw the impatience in the slight tremor of his fingers. He was waiting for the performance to be over so he could claim his prize. He wasn't planning a future with me. He was planning a future built upon my ruins. The yacht in the Greek Isles, the life free of complexity, it was all for him. And I, the trusting, loving, foolish wife, would be left with nothing but the ashes of the life he'd torched. The realization was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless, cold, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. A strange preternatural calm descended over me, encasing the frantic terror in a shell of pure, cold fury. My father hadn't raised a victim. He had raised a fighter. I had just been lulled into forgetting it, as Mr. Griffith paused, his piercing eyes lingering on my face with an expression I couldn't yet decipher. Damien seized his moment. He stood up, the epitome of grace and control, smoothing the front of his custom-tailored suit. He still held the slim, expensive leather portfolio that contained my signed surrender. "Mr. Griffith," he began, his voice resonating with a perfect, fraudulent note of sympathy that made my skin crawl, "if I may interject. This is, of course, an incredibly emotional moment for my wife." He placed a hand on my shoulder. It was meant to look supportive to the others, but to me it felt like the hand of a jailer, heavy and proprietary. Juliet is, as you can all see, completely overwhelmed by the scale of this. In anticipation of this very moment, and to ease her considerable burden during this time of intense mourning, she and I have already made prior, legally binding arrangements regarding the stewardship of the estate. He opened his portfolio and laid it on the polished mahogany with a soft yet incredibly arrogant thud. Juliet has executed a full and irrevocable transfer of all inherited assets into the Moreau Family Trust, for which I am the sole managing trustee with full power of attorney. We both felt this was the most prudent and stable course of action for the future of Moreau Enterprises. Here are the documents, signed and notarized just last night. He slid the papers across the table toward Mr. Griffith took his seat at the head of the table, the patriarch of this somber ceremony. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness, and opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The moment the steel trap, so lovingly baited, would snap shut. I could feel Damien's fingers press into my shoulder, a silent, unequivocal command to play my part, to be the broken, grieving widow who needed her strong husband to take over. My father's voice, no longer a faint echo but a roaring command in my soul, thundered, "Do not let anyone ever make you small." I drew in a breath. It was a shaky, ragged thing, but it was air. It was life. I lifted my chin and looked directly at Mr. Griffith, past Damien, as if he weren't even there. "No," I said. The word was quiet, almost swallowed by the vast room, but it landed with the force of a dropped stone in a still pond. Damien's fingers tightened, a painful, reptilian warning. I ignored it. I found my voice, and this time it was louder, stronger, forged in the fires of this fresh betrayal, and tempered with the steel I had inherited from my father. "No," I repeated, my voice clear and ringing. "That is a lie." I stood up, shrugging his hand off my shoulder with a force that made him flinch. I faced my husband, the man I had loved and mourned for, and I saw a common thief in a beautiful suit. The mask of charm had finally shattered, replaced by a flash of pure, venomous rage in his eyes. I turned back to the head of the table. Mr. Griffith, I was deceived. I was told those documents were for joint management, a temporary measure to help me through my grief. The arrangement Mr. Kane describes was procured through deliberate deception, emotional manipulation, and fraudulent misrepresentation. I was taken advantage of in my most vulnerable state. I contest this claim, and I hereby revoke any and all agreements I may have signed. The atmosphere in the room, already thick with tension, became electric. Damien's face cycled through a series of emotions with stunning speed, from shocked disbelief to crimson rage, and finally settling on a sneer of dismissive arrogance. "Juliet, what in God's name are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a low, menacing current meant only for me. "Sit down right now. You're hysterical. You have no idea what you're saying." He turned to Mr. Griffith, attempting a condescending, placating smile. "I apologize for this outburst. She's clearly overwrought. The grief can manifest in unpredictable ways. Perhaps we should postpone?" But Mr. Griffith was not looking at Damien. His sharp, glacial gaze was fixed on me, and in his eyes I finally saw it. Not pity, not surprise, but a profound, knowing respect. A slow, almost imperceptible nod of approval. He held up a hand, a gesture of such calm and absolute authority that it silenced Damien mid-sentence. "Thank you, Juliet," Mr. Griffith said, his voice even and steady. "Your objection has been formally noted and is on the record." He then turned his attention back to the large leather portfolio in front of him. With a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he reached inside and withdrew a second, much slimmer envelope. It was made of thick, creamy parchment and sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing the familiar M of my father's signet ring. "Your father was a truly brilliant man, Damien," Mr. Griffith said, his voice dangerously soft as he cracked the seal. "Brilliant, meticulous, and an exceptional judge of character. He foresaw a great many things. He always believed in hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. He called this his contingency. I knew him well enough to know he considered it a test." He unfolded the single sheet of paper within and put on his reading glasses. "This is a formal codicil to the last will and testament of Elias Moreau," he announced to the silent room. "It is to be unsealed and read if, and only if, the following condition is met." He paused, looking directly at Damien over the rim of his glasses. Damien's face had drained of all color, leaving it a sickly, pasty shade of gray. "Mr. Griffith continued, his voice ringing with the triumphant finality of a judge delivering sentence. "In the event that my daughter, Juliet Moreau Kane, should see fit to verbally and publicly contest, during the official reading of my will, any claim made against her inheritance by her husband, Damien Kane, on the grounds that said claim is fraudulent, signed under duress, or otherwise misrepresented." A choked gasp came from Aunt Iris. My own hand flew to my mouth, my vision blurring with sudden, hot tears of disbelief and overwhelming love. Damien staggered back a half step, looking as though he had been physically struck. But my father's brilliant posthumous strike was not yet complete. Mr. Griffith's voice boomed with righteous power. "Then any and all previously signed agreements, trusts, transfers of power, or legal documents of any kind executed between my daughter and her husband are to be considered immediately, irrevocably, and unconditionally null and void." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final crushing blow. "Furthermore, upon the activation of this very clause, a secondary protected trust, the Moreau Protectorate Trust, is to be immediately established. This trust, containing an additional 25% of my liquid assets held in reserve for this specific purpose, will be added to Juliet's primary inheritance. This protectorate trust is legally structured to be impervious to any spousal claim, past, present, or future. It was my final gift to my daughter, the knowledge that her greatest fortune would only be unlocked by her own strength, her own voice, and her own courage to stand up for herself." Mr. Griffith lowered the paper, his kind, craggy face softening as his eyes met mine. "He never doubted you, Juliet. Not for a second. He just trusted that you would find your way back to yourself." Damien stood frozen, a statue of ruin, publicly and masterfully annihilated by the foresight of a man he had so fatally and so foolishly underestimated. I returned to the house on the sound alone. Damien had been quietly and firmly escorted from the offices of Griffith & Sons, his handsome face a grotesque mask of impotent fury. He had sputtered threats of lawsuits, accusations of conspiracy, but his words were just the empty hiss of a deflating balloon. Griffith, attempting a condescending, placating smile. "I apologize for this outburst. She's clearly overwrought. The grief can manifest in unpredictable ways. Perhaps we should postpone." But Mr. Griffith was not looking at Damien. His sharp glacial gaze was fixed on me, and in his eyes I finally saw it. Not pity, not surprise, but a profound, knowing respect. A slow, almost imperceptible nod of approval. He held up a hand, a gesture of such calm and absolute authority that it silenced Damien mid-sentence. "Thank you, Juliet," Mr. Griffith said, his voice even and steady. "Your objection has been formally noted and is on the record." He then turned his attention back to the large leather portfolio in front of him. With a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he reached inside and withdrew a second, much slimmer envelope. It was made of thick, creamy parchment and sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing the familiar M of my father's signet ring. "Your father was a truly brilliant man, Damien," Mr. Griffith said, his voice dangerously soft as he cracked the seal. "Brilliant, meticulous, and an exceptional judge of character. He foresaw a great many things. He always believed in hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. He called this his contingency. I knew him well enough to know he considered it a test. He unfolded the single sheet of paper within and put on his reading glasses. It is to be unsealed and read if, and only if, the following condition is met." He paused, looking directly at Damien over the rim of his glasses. Damien's face had drained of all color, leaving it a sickly, pasty shade of gray. "Mr. In the event that my daughter, Juliet Moreau Kane, should see fit to verbally and publicly contest, during the official reading of my will, any claim made against her inheritance by her husband, Damien Kane, on the grounds that said claim is—" My own hand flew to my mouth, my vision blurring with sudden, hot tears of disbelief and overwhelming love. Damien staggered back a half-step, looking as though he had been physically struck. But my father's brilliant posthumous strike was not yet complete. Mr. Griffith's voice boomed with righteous power. "Then, any and all previously signed agreements, trusts, transfers of power, or legal documents of any kind executed between my daughter and her husband are to be considered immediately, irrevocably, and unconditionally null and void." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final crushing blow. "Furthermore, upon the activation of this very clause, a secondary protected trust, the Moreau Protectorate Trust, is to be immediately established. This trust, containing an additional 25% of my liquid assets held in reserve for this specific purpose, will be added to Juliet's primary inheritance. I would fill this magnificent quiet house with friends, with art, with life, all on my own terms. The betrayal had carved a canyon through my heart, but it had also revealed a deeper, stronger bedrock underneath. It was my final gift to my daughter. The knowledge that her greatest fortune would only be unlocked by her own strength, her own voice, and her own courage to stand up for herself. Mister, he just trusted that you would find your way back to yourself." Damien stood frozen, a statue of ruin, publicly and masterfully annihilated by the foresight of a man he had so fatally and so foolishly underestimated.